Hello everyone, it's Tom Slater here. Before we get into this episode of Last Orders, I just wanted to let you all know that Brendan O'Neill's brilliant new book, A Heretic's Manifesto, is now back in stock on Amazon. Amazon had a bit of a glitch there for a while, but it's now fixed, I'm glad to say. So if you try to purchase your copy from there and couldn't, do go back now and get your copy. Or if you'd like a signed copy, we still have our very special offer running. So anyone who donates £50 or more to Spiked will get a free signed copy of the book while stocks last. To donate your £50 and get your signed copy, go to spiked-online.com/donate. That's spiked-online.com/donate. We'll also throw in a whole year's access to Spike supporters as an extra thank you. Thanks so much. And now on with the show. Welcome to Last Orders, the Spike podcast all about freedom and the nanny state. In this episode, we discuss the scourge of the online safety bill, the latest on the ultra-processed food panic, and Chris gives us his regular monkeypox update. Hello and welcome to Last Orders. I'm Tom Slater, editor of Spiked, joined as I always am by Chris Snowdon from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Tom. Hello, listeners.
Coming to you live from a very sweaty room in the Institute of Economic Affairs, which we're glad to put this up.
It's a scorcher.
And we're delighted to be joined once again on the show by Claire Fox, Director of the Academy of Ideas and an unaffiliated life peer. Claire, thank you so much for coming back on the show today.
Great to be with you.
So, Claire, let's start with you because one of the reasons we wanted to get you back on the show was to talk about the online safety bill, which has been making its way through Westminster for many, many years now. But at this point, I believe is in the committee stage in the House of Lords. I know you've been very much involved in the debate around this particular piece of legislation, which seems to be trying to kind of solve all problems alleged and real with the online world. It's changed so many times. I think even those of us who write about it and try to keep track of it are a little bit confused. But where are we at with the online safety bill and what is still the problem with it, as you would say it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the horrible parts of it having dragged on is that people have got a bit bored with it and don't therefore realise what a major threat it is to free speech. We are at a situation where it's an enormous piece of legislation and it's been so anticipated that I thought the chamber, as it were, of the House of Lords would be packed with people from all sides, only to discover that there is an absence of anyone available. There's hardly anyone from the free speech side. It's basically two or three of us. It's a bit nerve-wracking. And in total, maybe 20, 25 members of the House of Lords are seeing this through. I think the backbenchers have been told to stay away. And just to explain that the reason for this seems to be that because the government have succeeded in convincing everyone that this is about protecting children from harm, that people don't want to kind of be seen to be being soft on children under threat from groomers, porn, suicide sites. Mm-hmm. But that's really only 20% of the bill. And 80% of it is going to be a serious assault on our ability to be free online. Just a couple of specific things, and then you can kind of ask me anything. I think the other problem we've got is that we all were very concerned about the legal but harmful clauses of the bill. The government had written that into primary legislation. There was a big campaign by civil libertarians and free speech organisations to remove legal but harmful. It was a success. Hurrah, hurrah. The problem is it's still there, but just not written explicitly into the legislation. And the two examples of that are that now you could say, oh, well, they're only going to ask the big tech companies to remove illegal material. When you think illegal, you think, oh, that's clear. That seems all right. Until you remember it's speech we're talking about. And illegal speech is something that is very contentious, even in terms of law courts, what is illegal, what is not illegal. So we are now asking big tech companies to make that call. And it's difficult enough when the police and the courts are doing it, never mind unqualified members of Silicon Valley's finest. And the second problem is that they simply have outsourced the legal but harmful parts to terms and conditions. So the way they've got around it is to say that every company has to hold consistent to their own terms and conditions, which have to be very publicly available for users to know the terms on which they will be able to post films, make comment, and so on and so forth. Effectively, that means that big tech will now be able to set a standard of speech that is perfectly legal in the UK, but which they decide their diversity, equality and inclusion policy won't let you say. And it will be illegal for them to show any flexibility. So if they were to, for example, say, oh, do you know what, it doesn't really breach our terms and conditions, we'll let it through, the senior manager might well be incurring on the company fines of millions of pounds and jail. I mean, they are going to put people into jail if they breach the conditions that Ofcom will set. So guess what? They're going to take down even more than the legal but harmful clause that prior existed. Scary stuff, eh?
No, definitely. And it's been interesting as well, because even, as you say, when you have what seems like a win in this area, like I remember at one point alongside legal but harmful going, there was this harmful communications offence which had been created, now seems like it's gone by the wayside. But the problem with that is that offence was going to replace the old Section 127 of the Communications Act, the grossly offensive thing. So you've just effectively, you've still got these kind of measures in law that criminalise offensive online speech.
You're absolutely right. And I think that the clue is in the boast that this is going to make the UK is going to be the safest place to be online in the world. And you think that's the kind of thing that President Xi would say in China, you know, no, China is the safest place, because, I mean, why couldn't it be we boasting that we're the freest place? But once you have safety, and harm is the word that you just used, and it was originally called the Online Harm Bill. But as you said, Tom, the problem is that throughout the bill, it's all about protecting people from harm. They even say they're going to empower users so that they can call for filters so that they never encounter harmful material. Who gets to decide what's harmful material? And of course, you're putting the power into the hands of the technology companies. And, you know, I'm not one of these people who thinks Google is evil or, you know, YouTube you can't trust. That's another reason, by the way, that there's been little opposition to this, because there's so much cynicism about the big tech companies already removing material. People don't feel as though it matters that you defend, in a way, them from regulatory government interference, because, you know, people are already cynical that they're all in it together. But we have to be very careful here, because they're being pushed to remove harmful material without any definition of harm. And so the offences that you were talking about will just simply be replaced by this regulatory regime, which means that there will be endless material removed without, by the way, the capacity to, as an individual, object on the basis they've decided it's harmful to a particular group of users because they're protecting, for example, protected characteristics or whatever it happens to be.
Can I ask a question? This is probably a stupid question, I don't know, but the part of that you discussed involving, you know, the obligation to take down illegal material. Well, if it's illegal material, why do you need another law saying you can't post it? If it's illegal, it's already illegal, right? Or is there something I'm missing? Is it because they're international companies don't have to abide by British law, or what is it?
Yeah, so I've asked that question, perfectly logical question to ask, but they would say that they are enforcing that no illegal material will appear. So, of course, this gets into the murky areas when it's being discussed, and goodness knows in the laws it's been discussed a lot. It's always around porn, and they're kind of like, there's been more discussion about porn in the House of Lords recently than you could shake a stick at, right? So they're always kind of like going into graphic detail about what could be posted and, you know, what avatars will be doing to each other, and it's all very grim. And then they sort of say, well, you know, this has to be removed, and it's not being removed. So they would say that illegal material is not being removed. But when you actually, when it comes to it...
In that case, prosecute them now.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. But the problem is, inciting hatred, for example, of a post, as you know, is highly contentious. So what happens is that somebody will say, you're transphobic and you're inciting hatred against somebody who's trans, if you're gender critical. At the moment, there's a tussle within the company. they will be under an obligation to remove hateful content if it's in their terms and conditions to remove hateful content.
Yeah, and they're going to err on the side of caution.
And then Ofcom, and then they will say, well, that is illegal because that's inciting hatred. But in fact, it's an ambivalent illegality. You know, what is, as we know, hate speech and how it's treated in the law is in different contexts already a contentious question. The idea that they are now being forced. So on paper, you could just say, well, it's illegal, so why not prosecute them? But they are actively saying you must trawl for illegality. Now, the other problem we have is that they then don't understand technology. This is the government. And it's so ironic because as we speak across the road, there is a major international tech gathering at which Rishi Sunak is, you know, partly claiming that the UK will be the home of technological innovation. But I cannot see how that can be because any tech company worth their salt is going to pull out. And one example of that is in terms of encryption, and we're most familiar with WhatsApp, but it could be Signal or anything else, where they have said, what you need to do is now search out illegal messages. Yeah. So they say to WhatsApp, search them out. And WhatsApp say, the executives say, well, we don't read people's messages. They're encrypted. And government ministers go, what? Can't you just remove them anyway? Well, how do we know what's in them if they're encrypted? We're not reading them because we have secret messages, right? They're encrypted. And you can tell that the government don't get this, right? And it's a very peculiar situation. So I'm saying that because they're then talking about scanning, and it's always on the basis of illegality. That there's secrets. But
don't politicians spend their entire bloody lives on WhatsApp because they think it's so secret and private?
When you threaten them with the fact that WhatsApp will be removed, they do look anxious.
Well, let's put it that way. That's where I have to split company with them because the only silver lining to this is if WhatsApp leaves the country, because I hate WhatsApp.
Yeah,
I'm a WhatsApp hater, but I love it. I would love them to pull out.
But I love it, and therefore that's a taste question. You don't have to use it, that's fine. But I like having a messaging service that I use, but that's neither. I mean, who cares what I think? The point is, it exists. It's a company that a lot of people use, and it's not just WhatsApp, by the way. It could be any, and the other options are available. What I'm saying is the government don't seem to understand even encryption, which they're going to undermine. That's what I mean about they don't understand technology. If you overregulate in the way that they are proposing, no small startup technology companies are going to make any breakthrough because they will not have the huge numbers of lawyers and regulatory regimes in place because they won't be able to afford to make any breakthroughs. I cannot see myself why anyone would base themselves here. And WhatsApp have pointed out, I don't want to fetishize WhatsApp, that they pulled out China, they'll pull out the UK, it's only 20% of their business and 80% elsewhere. So then why would they, in the end, they're not prepared to compromise their, the users. And Wikipedia have said the same, and they're a whole different ballgame, but they've got...
Wikipedia going to pull out as well? Sounds brilliant.
Wikipedia are one of those, not everybody likes them.
I hate them.
Yeah, that's fine. But on the other hand, they have millions of people who do user-to-user services. They've created a phenomena that you know about, right?
Yeah.
Which billions of people use all around the world, no matter whether you like it or not. And they're saying, well, people are anonymous when they're making these changes, right? And we're not going to divulge who they are. And the government are implementing a regime in which that anonymity will be compromised.
And again, the kind of lack of technical nous, you see it instantly because they say things like, well, can't you build a back door in your encrypted service, meaning it would no longer be encrypted. But it is interesting because, Chris, you talk about some of the speech is illegal, why not crack down on it? But at the same time, it feels like this legislation is almost... First of all, from the inception of it, it was about beyond just illegal content, hence legal but harmful and so on. But also, it seems if you had to design a piece of legislation that was going to fuel kind of extra legal big tech censorship, this would surely be it. I mean, you've seen other countries try and do this. In Germany, they just tried to put this duty on the big tech firms to just clamp down on what was illegal. And even that created this absurd situation where people who were satirising far-right politicians found themselves, again, kicked off of certain platforms, banned, etc., because of the fact that even a huge company like Facebook or Twitter, they don't have the capacity to be able to filter messages to this degree, at least present. A lot of the time they end up kind of farming it out, it seems, to almost call centres in parts of the developing world where people are going through things very quickly in a language they don't understand. So you have all these issues come through. But Claire, there's so much more that we could talk about with this. But in a sense, is the issue the fact that this quest for safety on the internet, full stop, this fetishization of safety, this idea that you ever could make the internet, let alone society, 100% safe, is that myth essentially what's fueling all of this, do you think?
I think that they've got away with saying that because definitely there are challenges for young people in terms of the online world being quite challenging, to say the least. And people can come across stuff that you wouldn't want your 11-year-old to see and so on. That's a real problem. And if they confine this to a children's online safety bill, then I'd at least feel consoled. Instead, what they've done is they've infantilized the rest of us. And I have only, by the way, touched, I don't know, a 20th of what's on there. I mean, I can't. It's a huge bill. It's got a million things in it. There's real threats to press freedom, all sorts of things coming through, disinformation, misinformation, the usual things. I think you're absolutely right, though, Tom. The overall point is that they are associating speech with danger and harm. And they are saying that the world can be made safer by censoriously removing certain types of speech. And of course, that, as we know, offline is a very big problem because it means that democratic debate is under threat. And so you inevitably, by the way, will not you might sanitize the official internet, but you will send more people down more rabbit holes, down more dark webs. And if I met up with a group of school pupils talking about something else, and they're already preparing how they're going to avoid this bill, right? Because, savvy 16, 17-year-olds don't sit there and go, oh yeah, we'll accept the fact we can't see what we want to see, that somebody else has deemed. I don't mean they were planning what porn they were going to watch. It was more stuff that is a bit that they thought might get banned that they wanted to. And they were laughing at the idea of these kind of grown-ups like trying to ban them. And I was like, sort of, yeah. And it's like Chinese young people. The Chinese state say you'll never be able to communicate or find out anything if you live in China. And you go to China to visit and they all go, how you get access to Google, or you want Netflix, what you have to do is this, right? They have got it sussed. I don't mean that means it's a free society, but it's not as though you will actually remove the threat to people via speech. But I actually don't think speech is the threat that they imply it is anyway.
No, completely. I think it's a very good point to end that section of discussion. And we've got so much more that we want to cover today, Chris. But should we turn to some of the nanny state stories that you've picked out? Should we begin with Panorama, which have done a documentary program on what's become a recurring topic on this podcast, which is the scourge of ultra-processed food, which it might be useful you reminding listeners what that actually is. But Panorama have got involved in this particular food panic. Do you want to tell us?
Yeah, I'll happily remind listeners what it is. Ultra-processed food, according to the people who are campaigning against it, has quite a simple definition, Tom. It is anything that's wrapped in plastic and contains an ingredient that you wouldn't find in your kitchen, which interestingly excludes salt, sugar, and fat, which are three of the few things that everyone's got in their kitchen. And they, of course, are the traditional dietary villains. So you're all right with sugar, salt, and fat now, suddenly, in 2023, since this revolution took place. And it has felt like a revolution. So Chris Van Tulleken, who's a TV twin doctor, he's got a book riding high in the bestseller list at the moment, Ultra-Processed People. Somebody else has written a slightly less successful book. Henry Dimbleby wrote his book, Ravenous, which touches on this stuff as well. And it feels like almost overnight this has become a diet fad that swept the nation. And there have been numerous articles from journalists saying, this is my story of trying to live without ultra-processed food for a week. It wasn't very easy, and my bread went off really quickly because there's no preservatives in it, and so on. And I mean, it's just to give the definition, kind of, is to debunk it, right? It's just obviously that is not a scientific definition of unhealthy food that is wrapped in plastic and contains something that you might not have in your own kitchen. And so Panorama got on this little gravy train, and it was a very odd episode. I mean, I hardly ever watch Panorama, and when I do, it's because I know I'm going to be annoyed by it. But I don't understand what the BBC Charter's for. I don't really think TV should be impartial, to be fair. I think everyone should be able to say what they want, really. But when it comes to BBC where you're forced to pay for it, I can see some kind of need for at least the impression of impartiality. I don't understand how these programs get made. I really don't. It's just one-sided propaganda. And in this instance, like quite reckless and very unscientific propaganda. So they kind of started off with ultra-processed food, but very quickly went on to some health scares that I'd more or less forgotten about, you know. So aspartame, for example, I haven't heard people panicking about aspartame for donkey's years. It's been tested to death. It's one of the most tested food products in the food supply.
Isn't that sort of thing's in a lot of your sugar-free?
Yeah, it's just an artificial sweetener.
Drinks.
It's an artificial sweetener, and as with all artificial sweeteners, people initially said, "Oh, it might cause cancer," so they tested it. You know, again and again and again, for 50 years, it doesn't cause cancer, as far as anyone can reasonably tell. But they found some old retired academic from the University of Sussex who thinks it's very bad for you, and he thinks that the science is all, you know, made up and so on. So, okay, fine, I guess. I mean, that's one thing. And kind of, if I may just digress a little bit, we have been trying to replace all the sugar with things like aspartame for the last few years with the sugar tax. That was supposed to be a great success doing that. And now, if what this guy's saying is true, it's been a disaster. This comes on top, of course, of the WHO saying a few weeks ago that artificial sweeteners don't work for weight loss and they may be bad for you, may cause cancer as well. And then we went from that to BPAs, which I'd totally forgotten about. That's biphenyl A, which way back in the noughties, if not earlier, there was a kind of scare about shower curtains. Do you remember this, Claire? It came over from America. The scare that the shower curtains could produce toxins when it gets hot water on it. And it was a lot of rubbish and it got debunked. But there's these things, BPAs, they are bad for people in certain respects. They're not particularly good, especially for babies. And I think they're being linked to infertility to some extent. But at the levels that you're ever going to encounter them in the real world, they are fine. Every health organization, agency in the world has said there's no risk at all from normal exposure. Except this guy, the same guy from the University of Sussex, comes on and goes, yeah, these things are really bad for you. And effectively accused the guy who runs the UK Committee on Toxicity of being basically corrupt. I mean, the BBC didn't quite say that because it would almost certainly be libelous. But they said, oh, well, this guy is on the board. He's an unpaid board member. I'll emphasize, unpaid board member of this big, I can't remember what it's called, International Life Science Institute, something like that. It's a big international science organization. They have conferences and all that. It's mainly funded by corporations, big food, big pharma, what have you. But this guy, you know, whatever you think of that organization, I don't know much about it. He's an unpaid board member. It's very unlikely that as a result of being an unpaid board member on this thing that is funded in some respect by food industry, he is going to say that something that actually is going to kill children is actually fine, right? It's just it's a mental conspiracy theory. And I can't believe the BBC broadcast it. And so this is why I say it's reckless. It's making people really scared of things they absolutely should not be scared of, including like plastic, you know, sandwich wrappers. It's irresponsible. It's stupid. The whole thing is getting out of control. And I really think this ultra-processed food scare needs to be nipped in the bud because it's really weird and kind of dangerous. And it's kind of legitimizing eating disorders, really.
Come from almost nowhere as well.
It feels like it.
Have you noticed this particular food panic, Claire? What do you make of it?
Yeah, well, actually, I think the broad trends are really dangerous, actually, because, you know, all you have to do is say big food. It's a bit like the big pharma, you know, and everyone goes into panic. And then I understand that food processing companies and big food, as is known, does make profits, which I know is a shocking thought. And that you know, that immediately makes them dodgy. Right. But actually, modern food technology has been a brilliant step forward in general, even though some of the food that we eat might be not the healthiest, but it can make it cheaper, more convenient, more accessible. Well, you know, so there's something really unpleasant about this notion that, you know, we want natural. I mean, what are people talking about? I mean, things that go off quickly.
Yeah.
You know, that's what they mean. And I think maybe because my mother was reared on a sort of dirt farm in Ireland, and she always used to say, you know, she remembered, as it were, plucking the chickens and drinking the milk before it was unpasteurized. You know, she said there is no glamour in Nature Knows Best, you know, and people can say, I want natural food. And she said, I don't. I was there when it was, you know what I mean? Like this was peasant life, right? And so I think that there's a dangerous romantic notion of an attachment to Nature Knows Best. And I think that deeply cynical attitude to big food is an anti-modernity question.
Definitely.
And we've seen it with big pharma as well. You know, it's like, yes, pharmaceutical companies are not, you don't have to believe every word they say and so on and so forth. But I do want medical science to have breakthroughs on everything from cancer to dementia. And I do think taking painkillers is a fantastic step forward when you're in pain. And I do not want to kind of go back to, you know, taking some old recipe from ye olden days, right? Where, you know, so on and so forth. So I just think that's the trend. But by the way, lots and lots of people I know now say there's a real problem, you know, with processed food. So it's kind of cut through.
Oh, it really has.
I don't even know that people know what they mean, but they kind of say it to you. And then they'll say things like, you can't be eating processed bread. I buy this bread. And there's two distinctions to be made between one bread and the next bread is that processed bread is cheap and that non-processed bread is not cheap. But that non-processed bread is not non-processed at all. It's made to dress up as artisan, homemade, home-kneaded bread. And of course, it's as processed as the really cheap stuff down there. It does sometimes taste better, the more expensive bread, by the way. But I'm just pointing out.
People do kind of picture when they hear ultra-processed food as if it's like a kind of the worst possible kind of Frankfurter recipe imaginable, like all of these kind of horrible things chucked into it. But as you're saying, Chris, presumably any kind of pre-packaged form of bread with some sort of preservative in it to make sure that it doesn't spoil quickly. Your average loaf of Hovis or whatever.
Emulsifiers and stuff. Yeah, I mean, I'm not involved in food manufacturing. Obviously, most people aren't. So you're not going to know the chemical names of these things. And this ultra-processed food thing is feeding on this sort of chemophobia. It's really just preying on ignorance. You know, it's literally saying if you don't know what this is, it's probably bad for you. Now, that is not a healthy or progressive way to approach the world. It's a really primitive way to approach the world. A suspicion of any kind of modernity. And, you know, there's 60 different types of emulsifiers. Are you saying that they're all bad for you in some way? They all cause cancer. They all cause obesity. Well, it doesn't make any sense that everything that you don't recognize on the ingredient list is bad for you just because you don't recognize it. I mean, it's the more you think about this, the more warped and bizarre it gets.
So the House of Lords had a classic example of the kind of nonsense that happens where on the 1 minute we're talking about the problems of food banks running out of food. And then a variety of lords decided to join in and say one of the problems with the food being given out food banks is that it's processed. And what were we doing about the fact that, you know, because people are donating tins of beans and tins of soup and that. Yeah. And it's like, and could we not, what is the minister doing about ensuring that at food banks, people aren't just being given processed food? And you literally sit there and think, for God's sake, right? Yeah. If you really do think that people are so poor that they need to use food banks, and some people are desperate, and I get that, the idea that you're going to go around plucking out the tin of soup on the basis that it's processed and therefore not, you know, healthy enough to give to the kid who's starving and wants a dinner. So it's just mad. I mean, but that's the kind of way that they have a moral superiority about we only like a certain type of food. But it's the ultra safetyism, but based on misinformation. I think, Chris, what you've said is really important because there's so much, you know, aggressive antagonism to what is called mis and disinformation. But then if it's a fashionable cause, nobody has to see the evidence. There is no evidence. It kind of just they can cite one professor and there's no evidence. And yet that's not what the BBC's disinformation unit is likely to be investigating, right?
Yeah. So they set this disinformation unit up only a few weeks earlier and they're putting stuff like this out. And God knows what the rest of the output's like, but I don't think it's probably going to be much better when it comes to current affairs, these kind of issues. Come back to what I said to start with. I don't get what the point of having a BBC charter is if you can put out totally one-sided information. Is there going to be a half hour when somebody represents the mainstream scientific view on this? No, there isn't, is it? You know, it's really like putting out some anti-vax thing for half an hour and having nobody kick back on it. it's really not that far off in terms of like the unscientific paranoia involved.
And with the veneer of impartiality and so on. But there's so many issues like this, like any of these nanny state issues we talk about. Climate is another one where the BBC don't even realise that they're doing it. It's like because it's the water that they swim in.
Yeah,
they don't get that what they're putting out is incredibly one-eyed until there's usually something which comes out which is so egregious that they're bombarded with complaints and they have to upbraid someone about it. But as you say, it doesn't justify it necessarily. Chris, should we talk about monkeypox?
Yeah, I've got some monkeypox
It's a bit
news,
of a
Tom.
sudden turn, but I know that this is an issue that we've been covering pretty extensively on this podcast. Probably one of the few UK
we're the
podcasts
only
to do so.
podcast that covers the monkeypox issue properly.
Yep.
I would say. There's not always that much news. Yeah, I mean, it's not a big story, to be honest with you. Monkeypox has not taken off as much as some people thought it would do. It's called Mpox now, of course. Pox. I did know, I just wanted to draw your attention to an advert from the UK Health Security Agency that is encouraging people to get vaccinated. And normally these vaccination adverts, I don't know if you see many of them, they usually like show somebody's arm with lots of spots over it, something like that, you know, kind of trying to scare you off the disease. And this one is a bit different. It's got a bright sunlight and a lovely orange background. And it says Mpox vaccination. First dose, please come forward by 16th of June. But the headline says, countdown to summer. Countdown to summer. Is Mpox a seasonal disease, do you think? And if it is seasonal, is it what's special? Why would it be circulating in summer?
We could speculate about
It's
this.
interesting. Well, I don't want to say, you know, a great deal about it, other than just to raise the issue of why. It does make it sound like a sort of summer essential, doesn't it? Get your monkeypox vaccine. It
Depends
also
how you
doesn't
like
mention-
to socialise, doesn't it?
Well, it does, exactly. It does. Maybe listeners can email us in and let us know if monkeypox is a seasonal disease and what they're going to be getting up to this summer. It also doesn't mention who's eligible for it or if there's any particular groups who might want to come forward. It just says, get your dose. So listeners, I'd say this is a public service. Summer's on its way. It's here, really, isn't it? Make sure you are fully vaccinated for Mpox. First and second doses by the 31st of July. Thanks,
Public
Tom.
service broadcasting here at the Last Orders podcast. Shall we get into the postbag?
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Postbag.
It's bulging, eh?
So I've got a question here from John Bryan, friend of the show, frequent questioner, and this is a good one. So what nanny state legislation do you fear the most if Labour win the next election? And what do you think we should be doing now to prepare to argue against it in the future? Claire, what do you think?
Well, the two things which they obsessionally go on about in terms of public health are smoking in the sense of just total removal, you know, just that's the end of that. And obviously that's now expanded into vaping. And so it's just anything that any smoke substance comes from you. And that sounds boring to say it, but you do think they actually are seriously going to try and destroy your capacity to smoke outside anywhere and so on. It's going to not be pleasant for the likes of me. And the other one, which I know that I'm sure that your listeners will be interested in, I do think there is a real dynamic that's been created by the Conservative Party, but which the Labour Party will really run with, and that is anti-gambling legislation, which is pretty obsessional in all the conversations. I know that's in the Lords, so you might think, don't worry about it. And I suppose finally, just the point that we were making about safetyism and harms earlier is the capacity for the Labour Party to show imagination is only ever exhibited when they're trying to ban things. And, you know, the things which they think can cause harm are just endless and relentless. And they're such technocrats and so boring and, you know, haven't got much to say until you say what is a threat to people that needs to be protected. And then they're off. It's like exciting. They're on a roll. So I think the biggest dread is that their instinct is to ban. So I'm afraid it won't just be smoking and gambling. It'll be just everything that is joyful or potentially alleviates the doom and gloom of everyday life or anything. It could be anything.
Anything to add to that, Chris?
Not really. I mean, I think I've said before that the Labour Party isn't going to be able to do a lot of things because it's not going to have the money. And so for that reason, I think it's really going to go to town on this stuff as like visible achievements. So yeah, they'll stop us smoking outdoors. They may well try and ban smoking altogether. They'll probably clamp down on vaping in some respect. They'll do all of Boris Johnson's obesity stuff, which I think Rishi Sunak is probably going to keep kicking back into the long grass. They'll do all that and more. I wish it wasn't so. I just don't really see any indication from the Labour Party that they're not going to go full throttle on it.
And I feel like in passing, we've actually just answered another question from someone called Koopy Bastard on Twitter. I'm sure that's actually their real name. About why is it that whenever politicians are in trouble, their first instinct is to think of something to ban. It does seem like both Labour and the Tories, in the absence of anything, any other idea in their head, any other notion of what their legacy vision might be, they just think, right, cakes, cigarettes,
disposable vapes.
I think it's even worse than that, which is if they're not banning, they're making a law about it. And that doesn't always involve banning. But the reason I'm saying that is because they're over-legislating. And laws are used as a compensation for the fact that you are not doing anything substantial in life. So you come up with a piece of legislation so that you can say, well, we've legislated about it. Yeah. And we've got a 500-page bill here, so we must be doing something. Whereas actually what they're doing is abdicating responsibility for actually resolving issues. So plenty of public order laws on the statute books that should be used against people who are more aggravating than they are demonstrating or protesting. They won't implement them. So what do? Bring in more laws that won't be implemented by the police, and everyone will carry on. And then when that doesn't work, they say, we're going to amend the law even more so that, so they accumulate.
Like making illegal speech illegal again.
Yeah, exactly. They accumulate more legislative powers, which they don't actually necessarily use, but it creates an atmosphere where actually they're not ever held to account for the fact that they have refused to give a lead morally, socially or culturally as to what they believe to positively be the way one should behave in society. They just bring in a law.
And Claire, we've got a question which I imagine is specifically for you, which is about the question of the House of Lords. Obviously, you're in a rare position in the Lords, I'm sure, which is that someone who's kind of anti-House of Lords, but within it, kind of fighting from within, if you like. And this question here is it time the Lords was abolished? So your time in the chamber, has that confirmed your view that this is a...
Or have you gone native?
It absolutely needs to be abolished. There's a couple of caveats, which maybe I've learned from being in there. First of all, that the way that the law is made in the UK makes the Lords and the Commons intimately tangled up. So if they abolish the House of Lords, it'll make Brexit look like a kind of picnic in the park because nobody will know how to make a law anymore. Do you know what I mean? It's like they literally won't know what to do. That's no excuse, by the way. The other thing is that via Gordon Brown's bill report, Keir Starmer has said that he wants to abolish the unelected House of Lords and bring an elected second chamber. And I was saying, good on him, right? And then I looked at the proposals and I thought, oh my God, because it's like sort of like the second chamber of the regions and nations and, and all the rest of it. It basically will mean that there'll be loads of Mark Drakefords and Nicola Sturgeons. No, exactly, all around the place, And then you think, oh, I didn't mean that. I mean, I actually just think that you should have an effective one chamber. And when people say, well, the Commons aren't scrutinising the laws well enough and that's why you need the Lords to... Well, that's because the Commons aren't doing a good job. You can't compensate for that way when it's the Lords. You should basically have a properly working elected chamber accountable to the people, and they should scrutinise the laws they're making and find ways of doing it instead of allowing undemocratic. It does make me laugh, because people sort of say, Boris is bringing his cronies in. I mean, I'm sitting behind the Labour benches. I mean, they were the cronies of Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. I mean, they're all cronies, right? That's how people get in. It's completely ridiculous to imagine that there was the great and the good, and now Boris Johnson's dragging it down. Basically, it was dragged down once they brought in anybody, political appointees.
You mentioned Boris Johnson there, Claire. We haven't got a question about this, but I'd be remiss not to ask you about Boris, given the fact that this is the week in which he's kind of disappeared from public life. He's left the House of Commons, certainly. As a figure in Westminster, a political figure in your own right, also ennobled, I believe, by Boris Johnson, though not party affiliated to him in that sense. What do you make of his quite sudden exit from public life, although one that was a long time in the offing?
Well, I can't begin to tell you how irritated I was when Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister, right? So, from COP26 to his campaign against obesity to lockdown measures, the suspension of civil liberties and a range of other things. So I'm no supporter of Boris Johnson. And at all. But the visceral glee with which his demise has been greeted by people who actually not so much resent Boris Johnson, but resent the voters who voted for him in 2019 is the thing which concerns me. In terms of whether he should have gone or not, I mean, whether it's a kangaroo court, all of that palaver. I mean, I think that there are questions to be asked about the process that has removed him, but it would be ridiculous to pretend that he played it straight. So I'm sort of torn on that. The only insight that I've got is that when people say, well, he's gone now, why is he complaining about the COVID inquiry and the handing over the WhatsApp messages? You think, well, in that instance, actually the COVID inquiry should have access to all material, and it's the government that's standing in the way of that material being discussed. And he's handed over his WhatsApp messages. I don't think you can say that's him continuing to interfere. I'm really bored about is Boris the answer? And I think it's a sign of the desperation of people being politically homeless, that they cling on to somebody who they imagine was the person that could have led us into a new realigned political world. But actually, he wasn't up to the job, and he actually squandered that opportunity massively. But the technocrats that replace him fill me with dread, and I can't, therefore, go on either side on this one.
Claire, Chris, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You've been listening to Last Orders. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please do take a moment to leave us a rating and a review. And if you'd like to support the show, why not become a Spiked supporter? Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to sign up. That's spiked-online.com/supporters.